Hi, this is lesson 3.6, the influence of revolutionary ideas. As you know, the American colonists were able to secure victory in the Revolutionary War, but here we're going to delve into how these ideas of freedom and liberty help change America and the world. This lesson has two objectives. You should be able to explain the various ways the American Revolution affected society. This is society in the United States of America. Also, in this lesson, you should be able to describe the global impact of the Revolutionary War and how it inspires other revolutionary movements throughout the world. So let's do this. In the Revolutionary period, there is this idea of freedom. How can we exist in a world of freedom and yet still have slaves? So, one way in particular the revolution inspired and changed American society was with the idea of certain individuals and groups calling for its abolition. It also leads to greater political democracy and more power to the people in both the state and national governments. So let's do a quick recap. Slavery was in all 13 colonies. Every single colony had slaves. It was most prevalent in the southern colonies, where enslaved labor was the basis for the plantation economy and the cash crops. However, it was located everywhere. The earliest calls for the abolition of slavery predate the Revolutionary War. There were long-standing ideas held by some religious groups, such as the Quakers of Pennsylvania, that do not believe in slavery. They objected to it from the very onset. Also, the very climate and geography of northern states really renders slavery not necessary. The northern states, formerly colonies, had commercial economies, and they did not rely on the labor of enslaved Americans. There was not as high a population of slaves in the North as well. There was also a greater influx of people. You have larger cities such as Philadelphia and New York and Boston, which means lots of immigrants and lots of different groups of people mixing together. So the straight up economic reality is that slavery in the North was not as necessary as slavery in the South. The final idea is this idea of the fundamental American values. We were fighting for life, for liberty, for the ability to pursue wealth and property and happiness. And there was a small group of Americans who simply could not reconcile the nature of slavery with these fundamental American values, the values that all men are created equal, which was so eloquently written in the Declaration of Independence. So there's this idea that it's very difficult. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. George Washington owned slaves. They were both leaders of the American Revolution, and they were planters who owned enslaved Africans after the war was over and for the rest of their lives. George Washington did, however, free his slaves upon his death. But eventually, what begins to happen is state by state, northern states and Pennsylvania, a Quaker state, will begin to abolish slavery. The first state to abolish slavery was during the Revolution, at the very beginning of the Revolution. It was Vermont in 1777. By 1804, every northern state had abolished slavery. However, it is very important to point out that it was done on a state-by-state basis, oftentimes having differing rules. Some had gradual emancipation, which means children of slaves would not be slaves. But if you were a slave, you'd still be a slave until you died. I think there was only one or two that just called for the outright abolition of slavery. So it was not a national mandate. It was state by state. Nevertheless, by 1804, all northern states had abolished slavery. And you can see this trend because we fought the revolution for the ideas of freedom and liberty and the pure idea of rights of man, natural rights, that we see the abolition of slavery occurring in the North. Moving on, our next is the idea of how the Revolutionary War changes the role of women. There is an idea of women played a vital role in the revolution, as we talked about. They boycotted, they made homespun, they sacrificed, they managed the household, they managed the farms, they managed the businesses for their absentee husband and their fathers, and they even took up arms. We will take one woman, Abigail Adams. John Adams was in the Netherlands, he was in France, he was gone. She managed the entire farm, estate, business with her 4 children. So it must not have been easy for these revolutionary mothers, so to speak. Some women were very vocal. Abigail Adams was very vocal. This is a very small minority. She was very vocal. She said the Declaration of Independence it covers everybody. They have the same inalienable rights as man. They are part of the social contract. However, that was a very small minority who felt that all men are created equal, also includes women. However, because the idea was there, though, that women were essential, this idea known as Republican motherhood develops. Following the war, it is an idea of women having a very big and important role, a very big role of educating their children to become virtuous citizens of the Republic. Typically, children did not go to school, but these women taught their children that you need to be a servant to the public. You need to be educated. It is necessary for a republic to continue to have educated people. Women, in essence, were training the future generations of America in their future role as Americans. What this means for women, because they were considered essential in educating the youth, women, for the very first time in some circumstances, were allowed to have an education themselves. So it was with great fortune that women were trained in the classics and able to go to school or be homeschooled. So you see, this idea of Republican motherhood is a huge turning point in the role of women. No, they had no political rights. They had no public rights or civic rights, but their role in society as educators of the children, as the keepers of the American fundamental ideas of liberty, was solidified in the years following. Keep in mind, however, Republican motherhood is mostly for the white middle to upper class women. If you are a slave, this does not apply to you. If you are a poor immigrant, this most likely does not apply to you. However, it is still a major shift in the role of women in society. Moving on to our final key concept. This is the second learning objective. What impact does the revolution have worldwide? So we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, this document that changes the world forever. The ideas put forth by Thomas Jefferson and his committee in the Declaration was the very first real world interpretation and implementation of the Enlightenment ideas of a social contract anywhere. Let that sink in. This is the first time in world history where there is a social contract of a government by the people for the people. That's huge. All other countries had the idea still of an aristocracy and hereditary privilege. So this idea is game changing, and the idea is copied by other countries. Following the French helping the Americans win the Revolutionary War, the French had a revolution. The French had extremely high rates of taxation. They had hereditary privilege. They had Louis XVI, who was their ruler. Louis XVI. Just that tells you something right there. They had hereditary aristocracy who were so out of touch with the people, so they overthrew their king. They killed and beheaded their king and his queen, Marie Antoinette. Thomas Jefferson, who happened to be in France at the time, wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man as the French version of the Declaration of Independence. He was all behind the French Revolution. Although the French Revolution got bloody, it still managed to overthrow their monarch and changed France forever. Moving down into a smaller Caribbean island, Haiti. Most of the population of Haiti was enslaved Africans. They were so inspired by the ideology of the American Revolution. Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, rises up against the French colonizers, and he leads the very first successful slave revolt in the modern world. Finally, in Latin America, Simon Bolivar led a series of revolutions against the Spanish Empire in the early 1800s. The Spanish Empire had been controlling all of these Latin American countries for 400 years, beginning with Christopher Columbus. And Simon Bolivar is critical, and this idea of liberty, they are critical in the founding of Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Panama as independent nations. So it is the ideas of the American Declaration of Independence that inspires change throughout the world. That is a hugely significant impact. So I do hope that you are able to explain the various ways the American Revolution affected American society, and also how the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution have a global impact.